I mentioned some of the methodology just on last evening when we were together, and certainly appreciate all of those who are coming back, but want to actually take today as an opportunity to deepen into that 7-step method. As we begin in any presentation and any moment that I have a pleasure of being a part of, we begin with at least one meditative moment. And so today I invite you to think on something maybe a little different for us, but it's a position of prayer and silence, meditation as a way of centering the heart, the thinking mind, and allowing us to indeed ingest the wisdom that we will be engaging in together. Now, contemplative practice includes meditation, and there are many ways of doing meditation, but I want to invite you to consider your own breath this morning. As you feel open and as you feel ready, you're welcome to stay on screen or go off screen. But I want to invite you to settle into the seat that you're in or into the stance that you're in. And just allow yourself to come into full awareness indeed of the breath of God, the Ruach within you. This may be done indeed by grounding the feet into the earth, by grounding your sitting bones into the chair, by opening your mind to the presence of God. Whether your eyes are open or closed, I invite you just for 1 minute to hold a deep breath, this space of silence. Inhaling very deeply and exhaling when you're ready. Take a moment to reflect on the inner workings of your own heart, the power of your own mind, the gift of the Spirit that you have been granted this morning. I will hold the time just for 1 minute while we carry in this silence together. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sometimes deepening in the mind and in the heart can actually give us just the right launching pad to recognize what our deepest and most full question is. As we moved from last night into this morning, I am sure, like you, many things have happened. There's been new news shared on a variety of different aspects of life. So the taking a minute to actually settle in helps us to reground the mind and the spirit. And actually, neurological science tells us that, and the whole tradition of neurology tells us that it actually helps us to center our mind and to clear our mind in new ways. That basic practice of contemplative thought or being is also an echo of Eco-Womanist spirituality, in that it allows us to ground ourselves and to hear beyond our own bodies, beyond our own minds, and indeed to hear from the earth. I want to invite your attention one more time to the screen as we begin to think about, let's see if we can get to the right place here. Very good. we're actually going to be thinking again about the definition of eco-womanism. And again, walking through the method, as I mentioned last night, a very clear definition of eco-womanism is that it is an approach to earth justice that centers theological voices, ethical perspectives, multi-layered analysis, and the experiences of women of color, specifically African-American women. As I mentioned, the work of eco-womanism has already expanded beyond certainly an African-American perspective. We'll focus on that one today, but it is important and significant that eco-womanism has actually expanded across the African diaspora and indeed the planet. We mentioned on last evening the significance of the contributions of African women's literary work and African feminist or African womanist theologies, particularly in this weaving of the virtues and the value of motherhood and family. We don't actually see that virtue and value raised in North American womanist theologians until probably the second or third wave of womanist thinkers. And so it is significant that that particular theme and value of mothering and motherhood is actually central to African feminists and African womanist perspectives. Eco-womanism really is an approach, not the approach and not the only approach. The kind of recognition that we have here is that there are a variety of different ways to get into the conversation around earth justice and environmental justice. Let me just take a pause here just to talk a little bit about vocabulary, which is really helpful and important. I've been on last night. You may have heard me use a variety of different terms, including earth justice, which signals a real definition and focus on justice towards the earth. It actually engages this idea of reparations and ecological reparations, recognizing that the earth self is considered a being, a part with a full agency and deserves justice. Environmental justice is another term that you've heard me use, and environmental justice work is a term indeed that was really coined and became famous by the work of Robert Bullard and many other African-American environmental studies, certainly leaders and certainly activists in the movement. Environmental justice really does signal the kind of intersectional analysis focusing on race and class and gender, et cetera, that is central to focusing on changing policy. So in terms of the comparison of just these two terms, earth justice and environmental justice, you might actually feel a little bit of a distinction. Earth justice really does lend itself to almost a more spiritual or spiritualizing understanding, a moral or ethical understanding of the earth as having agency, and that our attempt as human beings is to create more spaces for that to understand the earth's voice and what the agency of the earth is, and to create justice. In environmental justice, it is indeed a movement, and at least analytically really centers on communities of color, focusing on things like food justice, focusing on environmental health hazards, focusing on things like Cancer Alley and the realities of environmental racism. One of the important distinctions that you may feel kind of under the undercurrent of the conversation is that Earth has a being, Earth has agency, and Earth is actually being brought in the term of earth justice to the center. One of the critiques of the term environmental justice is that it is still anthropocentric, meaning that Earth is not necessarily the center, but that humans, and particularly humans of color, people of color, are more central. And so a lot of the conversation, a lot of the analysis comes out of some of the realities of oppression and the logic of domination that have impact and have impacted communities of color. Now, that anthropocentrism is significant, not just in these two terms, but the entire environmental movement, in part because one of the challenges has been to try to take out the addiction to human-centeredness. There are many approaches in environmental studies that are based on the human, to ask the question about why the earth is, what is the purpose of the earth, what should be the commodification or not of the earth, is typically based on the availability of the earth to humans for the purpose and progress of humankind. That anthropocentric perspective we find very much interladen with theological perspectives on stewardship of the earth, and certainly allows us to reflect again on the Genesis passage, the kind of King James Version, which essentially says that humans were created to have dominion over the earth. Earth justice suggests something different. It suggests indeed that the question of domination is not one that should be assumed, but that it should be critiqued, that there is a kind of relationality present in living with the earth, instead of living to be able to own the earth or control the earth or navigate the earth. So even in the terms of vocabulary words that we've discussed just this morning, earth justice, environmental justice, the environmental movement as a whole, you can see how even in the definition of eco-womanism, there is more room in it to recognize that the earth as being, that is reflective indeed of who and what eco-womanism counts as canon, counts as literature, it counts as resource. And if we dig just deep enough, eco-womanism is indeed a partner in the work of Black liberation theology, and therefore has roots to African religious traditions and certainly African cosmologies. In the same way that Black Christianity and African Christianities throughout the globe have deep connections to a cosmology of understanding the importance of Black life, Black skin, culture, the recognition that God and nature and humans are in this circle, cycle, this circle together. That cosmology shows up in eco-womanism in very important ways, recognizing that the earth too is a being. This steps away from a more anthropocentric approach. Now, there are lots of different critiques on how the methodology of eco-womanism has to hold a fine line between anthropocentric perspectives and voices and a deep line or commitment to African cosmology and peoples and perspectives of African descent. Let me just remind everyone that particularly in a kind of basic understanding of African cosmology, there are at least 4 aspects or 4 parts: God, humans, nature, and a spiritual realm, which often in African cosmology represents not only the ancestors, including the big brother of Jesus Christ, but a number of different ancestors, Ida B. Wells, the kings and queens of Africa, of many different tribes, the ancestral voices of those who have come before us, including the ancestral voices of those who are younger, but who have been lost or shot down: Michael Brown, Therese Wright, Tamir Rice, many others. So in terms of the accountability here, eco-womanism actually opens up the conversation beyond this particular moment. It invites the reality that we're talking about earth justice, not just from this time, but with an echo of all of the voices ancestral and all of the voices earth and earth-based that are in communion with us as we are in relationship with God. Let me just repeat that so that it's clear. Eco-womanism comes essentially to the conversation of earth justice with a different cosmology. It understands that there is a whole volume, an echo from the ancestors that also communicate a particular mandate to be able to care for and be with the earth those understandings, that connection, particularly to ancestors, this incredible kind of mapping of morality between trying to keep the lines of communication and connection open between God, humanity, nature, and the ancestors. This framework is very different than a kind of white Eurocentric framework when it comes into conversation with environmental thought. So as we move forward into thinking about the 7 steps of Eco-Womanism, it's important to recognize that as you reflect on, even honor your own experience, the step 1, that you may in fact be reflecting again on the shaping of those grandmother's hands who shelled peas on the porch growing up. It may indeed be reflective of the way that cotton feels in your hand as a person of African descent. And it may be reflective indeed of the kind of ancestral breath that you feel in your own body when you do deep breathing in contemplative prayer and meditation. The 7 steps of the method are essentially framed much like many different methods of liberation thought and liberation theology. So for those of us who have studied Black liberation thought, particularly feminism and the work of Cone, you will find that some of these methodological steps are familiar. They are intentionally that way. There is a deep connection between Eco-Womanist method and a lot of liberation methods, and that we always begin by honoring experience. Why? One of the reasons why Black liberation theology and certainly liberation theologies across the globe begin with experience is oftentimes it is this experience of peoples of color which has been banished or silenced in the work of creating knowledge or the work of actually honoring particular epistemologies. By starting with experience, we immediately value and validate the Blackness of a person, the experience of a person of color, the brownness, the culture, the heritage of that person, even, or of that being, even as we move forward. Here in the conversation that we've had last night, one way of framing the conversation around ecological reparations is to honor the experience of the tree, the lynching tree, and to actually begin to take a step into how do we begin to mitigate or face climate change when we actually see the issues, the problems, the challenges of climate change from the perspective of the tree. And typically when I teach the first step of Eco-Womanism, I invite students to honor their own experience with the earth. And this can be done in a number of different ways. I know Dr. Grant and others have explored this by essentially giving everyone an opportunity to write their own eco-memory or their own earth biography. This is an opportunity for people to engage how they came into their own climate consciousness or environmental consciousness in the first place. Was it a moment of prayer where you were outside and you heard the voice of God differently than you had before? Was it growing up near a farm or having connection to family members? Are you yourself a farmer? And in many cases during the course of the pandemic, have you found that in order to keep your God-given mind and maintain your own mental health, you have had to go outside, to breathe in fresh air, to reflect and to come back to your own centered self? Honoring those experiences as a part of the first step of the Eco-Womanist method. Now, reflecting on the experience begins to engage the thinking mind. So we invite the work here and the kind of practice of Howard Thurman as a contemplative Christian mystic, but it does indeed begin to help us to think about the experience with a somewhat analytical lens. Now, there are 2 analytical moves in the method. You'll see in step 2 is a beginning reflection on the experience, and then, of course, conducting actual analysis. Womanist Intersectional Social Analysis in Step 3. Just want to point out how these are just slightly different, particularly for those of us who are teaching the method or using the method in churches as people begin to start this process of interrogating or using or even applying Eco-Womanist method. Reflection oftentimes is a soft entry into thinking about connections that happen from the eco-memory. So for those of us in pastoral care and theology, any of us with any kind of background in trauma and skilled in working with people who have endured trauma, historical, racial trauma, etc., you will note that oftentimes the sharing of story is the first step. One does not ask a survivor to immediately reflect or analyze one story, but simply the courage to tell one story is the first step. The second step, of course, then is to reflect on the experience. How has my environmental consciousness been shaped by a particular theology, particular experience? For Eco-Womanism, there are particular examples of how to move into step 2, recognizing the connection with the earth, either in the past or in the present, or maybe even in the future. So this is the work of Bell Hooks, and this is some of the work that she's done in Sisters of the Yam. Touching the Earth is a wonderful essay or chapter in that book, Black Women and Self-Recovery, where she actually recognizes that it was her parents and her grandparents who had a very deep connection to the land because she grew up in the South. And that even as a New Yorker and living on the East Coast, she wonders and sometimes grieves the kind of connection that they had because she does not herself have it. So in reflecting on her experience of watching her grandparents, she begins to come in tune with the grief or an ache to be able to connect with Earth. In the essay, she talks very, very directly in a way of actually sharing that she herself does not feel that she has a green thumb in any way. And so she asked the question again, how can a Black woman living on the East Coast in variety apartments and so forth begin to have this connection with the earth? And she again goes back to a very basic understanding that the kind of basic framing of being a person of African descent means that she too has a connection with the earth, and it is simply a matter of practicing, gardening, exploring, and allowing there to be space for that earth connection. The earth as sacred is oftentimes embedded in Native American, Indigenous, and also African American religious orientation. And so here we understand the earth not as a commodity, not as a thing or an object to be controlled or abused, but really to see the earth and the connection to the earth as a sacred part. In some sense, there is, excuse me, thank you. There is a way in which we might actually understand the earth as sacred as a covenant with God or a commitment to God, to keeping and maintaining not just ourselves, our own wholeness even in a white supremacist context, but also to keeping the earth as whole and sacred, even in the contexts that are laid onto the earth. The shared experiences of beauty and suffering we spoke about just a little bit on that last night. This is the work celebrating Kimberly E. Ruffin. There is a way in which I believe that the concept that she has come up with, the beauty to burden paradox, actually does help us to see these parallels between how Black people, particularly peoples of African descent, have had a particular connection to the earth that is filled with both the beauty of the earth and also the suffering or enduring suffering, being called earth, right? Being bound to the earth in a different way. Dolores Williams' Sin, Nature, and Black Women's Bodies is an excellent example of how we might then step into the parallel between oppressions between Black women shared with oppressions with the earth. The third step of conducting womanist social analysis then allows us to actually kind of take and frame the first experience in step one, based on some of the reflection in step two, and then to take a real deep analytical approach in step to using race, class, gender, etc., as a way of getting into the conversation. Here is where the focus on policy and certainly environmental justice, interrogating cases and situations of environmental racism are really, really important and show up really as a part of the eco-womanist method. Well, I'm pretty sure many of you are familiar with womanist social analysis, so I won't say too much more there. The fourth step is critically exploring tradition. And in this sense, I am someone who's ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so part of my ordination orders, part of my ordination exams were to know particular hymns, to be able to have a sermon in my back pocket, and certainly to know the theologies that were traditional for the AME Church. One of the gifts that we have in the Eco-Womanist method is to actually begin to explore critically some of the tradition. And so what I have come to know is that some of the hymns that are normative and celebrated in my own tradition as a Black liberationist, as someone who practices Black religion, have within them a different frame of earth orientation. That is to say that there are glorious songs that actually include the earth, or elements of the earth, mountains, air, water, oceans. To take a moment of actually critically exploring this, I might actually take a hymn and ask the question, what was the hymn writer, or what is the meaning of the song for those of us when we do sing about water, sing about mountains, overcoming trials and tribulations? Well, I find that this is particularly important for works, particularly music, that engages the voice in the Psalms in any way, the lyrics of the Psalms. So actually critically exploring this is important. As I mentioned last night, what we can find, though, is that there can be a disconnect between the theology that is written into the tradition and the theology that's actually going to help us into a better relationship with the earth. So in some hymns and in some practices, some theologies in Black religion, it has been important to bifurcate heaven apart from earth. In these cases, one of the gifts of eco-womanism is to at least ask the question, maybe not throw out the hymn or the tradition, but to ask the question critically, how might we massage, change, or even transform the theology to actually recognize the dangers of that bifurcation and dualism for the work of climate justice? Engaging transformation is step number 5, and here is where indeed we find that there are ways to explore, the ways to expand and even change one's theology based on what one finds or discovers in eco-womanism. Now, this may not be as radical as understanding or changing one's high Christology to a low Christology, but it may indeed help someone to know that the space is available for them to consider that their relationship with the earth is much more significant than they originally thought. Sharing dialogue is step 6 of the eco-womanist methodology, and this becomes really crucial and invites a lot of dialogue and even transformation, in part because of the centeredness around African cosmology, which is alive very deeply in womanist thought and Black liberation thought and Black religion generally, actually opening the door, what Dolores Williams calls, even as a Christian theologian, a multivocal way of being a womanist. Multivocal suggesting that to be Black is not a monolithic thing, that there are a variety of different ways of practicing Christianity, a variety of different ways of being Black, a variety of different ways of being a person of African descent. And in so doing and noticing, we actually can, in fact, come into a reality that our commitment to the earth may actually have many more approaches than just one. Our transformation then can actually be helped by being in conversation with those who do not believe or look like us. The final step of Eco-Womanism is to take action for justice. And this is particularly important in part because it immediately names that a part of what we are protesting is the logic of domination, the dualisms. And even though those dualisms are part of the Christian tradition of many different conceptual frames that we use as thinkers in the Enlightenment, after the Enlightenment, but to suggest that there is a connection between the logic of domination and racial ignorance, white supremacy. When we recognize that white supremacy is not the only logic of domination, we also recognize that the justice work for the earth is actually much grander than just looking at the environment. We also need to look at logics of domination, such as those that exist in sexism and practices of patriarchy, such as exist in hetero practices or homo practices, where we actually begin heterosexist practices, where we actually begin to set aside certain peoples based on their sexual orientation or their sexual identity, to exclude earth beings because of who they are or how they were created or how they choose to manifest themselves. One might argue is not the role of the human, that those are actually parts of God's work. We could ask this then the question, where does sexual orientation recognize, how is it recognized by the earth? What does the tree see in recognizing a gay and lesbian or transgendered person? Does the tree, does the climate, does the earth see the difference between someone who is from the LGBTIQ community and someone who is a white supremacist? The argument essentially is that by taking a perspective from the earth, we might actually be able to dissolve some of the distinctions that we make that separate or bifurcate each other from earth community. It is the case that for Eco-Womanism, earth justice is social justice, and social justice is earth justice. To create truly beloved community, an earth community, there must be full interrogation of every logic of domination, every bifurcation, every attempt to fragment anyone, any being from the earth. In terms of other thinkers that we might invite into the conversation, or you might be thinking about exploring as we move forward and through eco-womanist methodology, I certainly lift up the work of Chris Carter, and particularly his work is coming out on food, soul food, very, very soon. I'm very excited, but he also has done some remarkable work and some essays out of the Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Nature. And then, of course, I've mentioned Kimberly E. Ruffin, but there are many others, freedom farmers, that really focus on the work of Fannie Lou Hamer, and the history of freedom farmers in the United States of America, which is significant in part because they were freedom ways of being, ways of actually exploring Black religiosity, Black freedom that honored the farm, that honored the connection, that honored the agricultural knowledge that Black people have actually always held. Let me stop there and open us up for a conversation. Thank you all so much for your attention. I am sure that some of what we shared today will encourage and empower some new questions. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Harris. I have, my question is, I'm actually very interested in number 4 of critically exploring traditions. And I would like you to give an example of a hymn that you think can be a good starting point of exploring the tradition in the way you're talking about?
Sure. Thank you. It's a very good question. Yeah. You know, one of the favorite hymns that my father in ministry gave to me was Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine. But there is also the wonderful hymn of It Is Well With My Soul. Even the song Amazing Grace and the origins, right, of that song, the author of that song, as a white slave owner, essentially being convicted as someone who owned slaves and actually beginning to turn the tide. When I think about even the work and the history of Precious Lord, Take My Hand, there are lovely allusions here of earth and water in the lyrics of these songs. So let's take that last one in particular. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am weak, I am worn. Here, what's often comes to me is the singing voice of Mahalia Jackson, singing this particular song at the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. It's significant to me that we actually capture the voice of a Black woman and the real deep kinship and kind of sisterly affection that she had for King, that there was a way in which their theological quandaries and their own commitment as leaders in the civil rights movement were shared with and by and for each other. And that the loss of King was significant for everyone, but it was also particularly significant for Mahalia Jackson. When we think about Precious Lord, we really do recognize that there is this hand-in-hand relationship oftentimes with God and the person. And that kind of intimacy of relationship is one that is significant, I think, theologically, when we reflect on it critically from an eco-womanist perspective, because there is an interconnectedness in that holding of the hand, take my hand. An interconnectedness, that is to say that there is an intentional awareness that this human, that the person, the daughter, the son, the faith keeper is asking for, begging for a connection with God. I think what we often experience in the singing or the hearing of Mahalia Jackson or any powerful person who sings this is that that connection is actually already present, and that the song indeed is asking for the connection, but that the connection is already present. Here is where the theme conceptually of interconnectedness lies for eco-womanism. One way of critically exploring this particular example of tradition is to ask the question, where does and how does interconnectedness exist already or is reflected in the singing or the performance of this particular song? It suggests that not just is there an intimacy that one can have with God, but that intimacy is actually a part, it's already mapped out as a part of one's being. If that is the case, and that cosmology from which we understand is not only linking humans to God, but also humans to the earth and God to the earth and humans, then that person whose hand is being held by God as the human asks to that their hand be taken by God, and God's self are not the only elements in the song, that there is a way that this interconnectedness is also reflecting a presence of nature, that you actually can't separate the person and God apart from their connection to nature in any way. So that kind of critical reflection is just one example of how you might do that. Essentially, what one does is give a very common example, a common hymn or a common theme, invite people to see the earth in the lyrics, to recognize what would the earth say, right? What elements of the earth are celebrated in the lyrics, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's very obvious, in terms of mountains and fields and the colors of yellow, red, et cetera. Other times there is a deeper spirituality to, such as the one we've just named. And the theme, of course, that we just uncovered in that critical examination is the reality of interconnectedness. One cannot take oneself out of God's hands. God is always holding one's hands, even as you pray it, right? But as you experience it. And it is the case that, at least for humans, because of our need for oxygen, et cetera, one cannot take oneself out of the love, the breath, the space of the earth. You actually have to have earth in order to exist, which is one of the reasons why climate change is so scary for many of us. Humans can't exist without the earth existing. Thank you so much for that question. I hope that helps.
It
So
does.
you're not saying that all of the elements that you talked about with Eco-Womanism have to exist in every situation, that there are perhaps some situations where you may have God and humans and not nature, or God and ancestors, but humans would be involved, but maybe not nature. There is a link between ancestors and nature. Would you work that out for me, because I'm having a little problem there?
Sure, it's a good question. When we think about African cosmology as a frame, it actually is the case that all these elements of cosmology exist in relationship with each other at the same time, simultaneously. So if we just think about a quadrilateral, right? And for many theology students, it's easiest to think about the method as quadrilateral. But if you just think about 4 different blocks, you might actually put God in one corner, humans in another corner, the spiritual realm and ancestors in another corner, and nature in another corner. It's more in keeping with African cosmology and just African thinking as to put it in a circle together. So if you think about it as a pie with these particular 4 parts, it is the case that on the lines that connect each of these corridors, there is an intersharing, an interwebness, an interconnection. And in fact, the way that most African cosmology operates is that everything is cyclical, meaning that all of these elements are in each other at different times and in different beings. So I think one of your questions was actually, kind of suggesting that maybe there are elements where it's just God and humans. But actually, to be human means that you actually have to, if you're breathing, you actually have to have access to oxygen. So immediately, nature is present. Does that help?
Really helps. Yes, it does.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you so much.
Yeah, sure. It's a different way of thinking, right? Because oftentimes, in our kind of Western education and our kind of post-Enlightenment thinking, and sometimes because we ourselves, have been a part and sometimes complicit in a logic of domination or a way of thinking that actually bifurcates. One of the gifts, I think, of Eco-Womanism is that it actually kind of lifts the mind or makes one aware of all of the kind of logics of domination that we actually have been ingesting. So it's similar to the work of anti-racism, particularly with communities of color and Black peoples, where we're invited to consider that we can't always focus on what's happening and what needs to happen in the white mind or in the white person or in the white community, but that in some cases, white supremacy has been ingested into Black life and Black lives and Black minds and Black ways of believing and being, such that we see so much of the Black church tradition, the white Christ present fully, and the white supremacist understanding that the blue-eyed Jesus is the only way to save a Black soul. They're Black people, they're Black communities who historically have believed this. And that is a form of internalized racism. In the same way, Eco-Womanism, and particularly step 4, invites us to at least begin to uncover the kind of logic of the domination that we may have accidentally or by instruction ingested, that are not actually for our own wholeness or for the wholeness of the earth. So in that sense, the kind of anti-racist frames are helpful or work alongside with this work of anti-racism.
I have a question, Dr. Harris. So with Eco-Womanism, as it relates to, you talked about liberated theology. And to me, it's being a Black African-American woman, how would that look, or how am I to explain that as far as it relates to my own experience. I'm trying to correlate the two. Eco-Womanism, you talked about liberated theology, and then me being a Black African-American woman. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Sure. The phrase that you're using is actually just a little different, but it is an important frame. Liberated theology is what I just heard you speak, which is important. I think that a liberated theology is a free theology, which actually really does kind of focus on the aspect of freedom and the aspects of freedom that are possible in one's theological perspective. Liberation theology, in the phrase that I'm using, is actually a tradition, right? And so Black liberation theology is a school of thought, essentially, in theology, whereby we actually focus on particular theological assumptions or presuppositions. One is certainly in Black liberation theology that God intends for Black peoples and all peoples to be free, fully liberated. So there's immediately a kind of opening to the critique of any system of oppression or any system of belief that tries to keep Black peoples bound. That tradition is what we call Black liberation theology. And so there are lots of different, theologians in that tradition. Cone, James Cone, Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams, some of those who I have called even in our time yesterday and today. What I hear in your reflection, though, is a little something different, which is to also look at the centeredness of an African-American woman's voice. And that's actually the voice that womanism in particular begins to give voice to and works for and with. Eco-Womanism is built. It is a school of thought which centers African-American women's perspectives. Some of those African-American women's perspectives are deeply committed, not just to justice, but also to freedom and freedom to the Black woman's self. And for many of us, one of the reasons why we choose the term womanism versus feminism is because historically, womanism has not just included African-American women and women of African descent, but their communities as well. And in the history of Black feminism and feminism generally, at least in the North American context, feminists really came out of a kind of white middle-class woman's understanding of gendered justice. And oftentimes the practice of feminism negated the presence of men. So the sons and the husbands and the fathers were actually put to the side and disinvited in the thinking of how to create justice, gender justice. Womanism and African-American women, in the words of Alice Walker and much of her work, she says, I'm not giving up Stevie Wonder. And I'm definitely not giving up, Miles Davis. I'm not giving those people up, and they happen to be male. And so one of the biggest distinctions, I think, of womanism from feminism is that historically, womanism has always been inclusive of, first, Black women, African-American women, and has been written and articulated to center that particular voice, but also that experience, meaning that oftentimes African-American women, hopefully in healthy ways, are connected to men and other beings on the planet.
I have a particular question, Dr. Harris. If we think about 2 Chronicles 7:14, where God said that if we humble ourselves and pray, he will heal our land. So if the land is healed, then of course, then we can be healed. Is that correct? Is that what?
It's a good, yeah, I think that is correct. Some of the resources I think that come out of Eco-Womanism that provides support for that is indeed this work that comes out of Bell Hooks and others, recognizing that as Black people can heal themselves, as Black people can focus on healing and wholeness for themselves, they will find that they are also doing environmental justice work, that they are healing the land and therefore repairing this relationship between God and humans and the land. That's a great example, a great scripture. It's significant that bell hooks, particularly in this essay, is actually, although she was influenced by Christianity early on in her life, as many African-American people have, in this particular essay, she uses the work of contemplative practice through a different religion, which is Buddhism, in part because she recognizes in Buddhism this deep interconnectedness, and there is not really a webbing onto the idea of fragmentation or bifurcation or dualism as there is in Christianity. We have a lot in Christianity to kind of struggle with in our logic of domination because of dualism is so deeply a part of our frame. It's important in our Christology to know that Christ is human, but also divine, but that we ourselves cannot be Christ. Right. And there are certainly separations. And so Buddhism actually offers a different way in. This is one of the reasons why Eco-Womanism methodology begins to engage transformation. Step 5 and step 6 are deeply important, in part because in sharing dialogue with bell hooks and in recognizing, as you've just mentioned, this kind of Christian scripture as a base, we recognize that there is a deep unity, and there can be a deep unity. I think from a Christian perspective, I would say that God intends for there to be a deep unity between the healing of the self, the healing of the community, and the healing of the land in order to be in that kind of cosmological union that we talked about.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think our conversation today is so helpful and enlightening, in part because it suggests that the work of interrogating the self, but also being self-compassionate is very important. It's one thing to come into any justice work, but especially environmental justice work, with a deep racial consciousness about all that needs to happen, all that the white environmentalists need to do, all of the kind of anti-racist training that they need to do in order to see us. But I think Eco-Womanism is unique, and because it talks to us. It's a discourse that privileges and centers Black people and Black lives and Black faith. And so in that sense, it's asking us to dig up out of ourselves any logic of domination that may be remnants of the history of enslavement in the United States of America, to be truly nonviolent. And to actually ask ourselves, are there religious aspects, religious theologies within us that are actually not healthy for us? And how do we then shape a way of thinking and loving Christ in a way that's truly healthy, not just for us, but healthy for the planet? Thank you. I recognize that we're just about at time. Is there any other final question or final comment before we conclude our lecture time together? Thank you all again for such brilliant questions and comments.
Dean, is it appropriate that I make this final comment before we conclude?
It's highly appropriate. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Harris, you have honored us as a contemporary curator and protector and professor of Eco-Womanism. We thank you for teaching and tutoring us with your rich wisdom and perspective. We'll be sending you 2 special items. One is consumable and one is more symbolic and enduring. And if I can hold up, let's see, this cloth.
Wow.
Let's see, well, I'm going to get a good picture of it. This cloth has a picture of, there it is, has a picture of the logo, which is on our marquee. And it is a cloth. We could call it a wash rag, but we won't call it a wash rag, but you know what that symbolizes. We know that this work can lead to tears, it should, but also some laughter, which could moisten the mouth to give birth to nurture of thinking, but also can lead to perspiration.
Mm.
So we and other forms of life-giving water. And so we hope that the cloth will be an element of pastoral comfort for you as you continue to do this work and you think of Hood and your journey with us. So God bless you and thank you for being a true sister in the struggle for this freedom of the world and the enhancement of humanity. God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you so much. Beautiful gifts, and such beautiful presentation. Thank you. My heart is deeply, deeply, deeply grateful to each of you all for your presence in your work and ministry. I too say to you, keep on, pray on, preach on, teach on, continue being and studying the word of God and how it unfolds to new levels and new heights for the sake of humanity and for the sake of the earth.
God bless you.
Thank you.